In today's episode, we're going to be learning how to compose tension/suspense music, but specifically for horror scenes. Now, the goal of this series is to introduce you to the different tools, plugins, and techniques that I use to create these tracks so that hopefully you too can start integrating some of these into your own productions. So the first thing we're going to do is listen to this track, but before getting started, I just want to bring up that this is actually a 90-second edit I made for a mock-up that I created. So if you want to hear this piece of music in context, I highly recommend checking that out. I'll be leaving a link to that video in the description box. But without further ado, let's get to the listening. All right, so the first thing we're going to be focusing on is this sound effects section we got over here. I also like to refer to this as the texture or the vibe because this is essentially the foundation of our track, especially in this tension/suspense genre. It's very much sound design based music, so we're essentially creating a soundscape over here. And what I ended up using for this one is 4 synthesizers from the Arturia V Collection 7 to be specific. So we got the CMI over here, which is a digital sampler. We've also got the Buchla ESO, which is a modular synthesizer. Got the ARP 2600, which is a semi-modular synth, and we also got another one over here. And as you'll see, it's just like a drone. It's just a long 16th note drone for all of them. So that's basically what it is. I guess you could also consider this kind of like a loop, but considering that it's a synthesizer, it's more appropriate to call this a drone. And what I also did is I bounced these to audio, and the reason I did that is because as I work and keep adding parts and rework certain parts, I may want to start like from here, for example, and if I do that with MIDI, it won't trigger the note every single time, so that can get annoying pretty quickly. So that's one of the main reasons why I bounce to audio, especially with these long sustained parts. It's something you're going to want to get into the habit of doing with these kinds of tracks, and it also makes it easier to work with and to manipulate. So. And last but not least, it definitely saves you on resources. I mean, look, I got to disable 4 plugins here, and but what I did do is I kept the MIDI track. I just muted it, and so the MIDI is still there. If I want to go back and make changes down the line, like, this is just a good habit to develop as well. So yeah, I'd say let's just listen to this section on its own, and you'll also notice that I have some automation going on. So I just have like a fade in at the beginning to blend these textures together slowly and gradually. And I also have some automation on the submix, a little 5 dB crescendo over here, and I mean, it's barely noticeable, to be honest, especially with the mastering and all the compression. But the thing is, it's these very small, subtle things that really make a big difference in the big picture of these minimalist tension suspense cues. So let's give that a listen. Okay, so the next section we're going to be focusing on is this percussion section we've got going on over here. So I'm just going to solo those percussion submixes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the plugin that I'm using to create these sounds. It's actually all coming from East West's Composer Cloud, which is a subscription-based service that includes all of their sample libraries, but everything you're hearing in this percussion example is either coming from Storm Drum 3 or Storm Drum 2. And you see I even ended up writing the actual name of the instrument that I used. The low foundational percussion is just a daiko drum, which is a really big Japanese drum. Bowed cymbals are fantastic for transitions, and that's exactly what I'm using them for. This gongs in water is kind of an interesting instrument. It's a gong, but because it's in water, it has just kind of like this low vibrational sound. You know, you're kind of cutting out all the overtones, so it just adds a little bit of like depth and fatness and low vibrationalness to the track. So I like that for this. The super effects here is that little bell kind of chimey sound that you're hearing a bit later on. And the ratchet is only in the full version of the track, so you'll hear that very soon, I promise. And same thing with the piano and this groover thing I didn't end up using at all. So yeah, anyways, let's just hear what this sounds like on its own. So that takes care of that. Now the next thing I want to focus on is this solo violin part, which actually doesn't sound like anything like a solo violin, and I'll be explaining what I did to make it sound that way. But first, I just want to mention that even though this is the only track I have routed to this submix, I'm still using a submix, And that's because it's just the way that I like to organize my sessions, and it also helps me organize my mixing process. And you're gonna see why that is a bit later on in this video. But yeah, so this is just the way I organize things. But now to explain what I did to make it sound the way that it does, it's just using a bit crusher. And it's the stock bit crusher that comes with Logic Pro. So that's how I got that to sound like that. And the sample I'm using is from a library called Hollywood Solo Violins. That's included in Composer Cloud as well. And I also use a free plugin, which is one of my favorite free plugins called Pancake, which depending on what you're using this, you're listening to this on, whether it's headphones or monitors, you may or not hear this, but it's just basically automating the panning from left to right. And there are different presets, but you could essentially do this without the plugin. It just makes things a little bit easier. But yeah, I really like this plugin. And yeah, so that takes care of that violin track. So let's just listen to that on its own. All right, so the last section we're going to be looking at is this second sound effect section I've got going on over here. And this is like, I guess, really important when it comes to this genre, because this is the stuff that really creates and generates the interest throughout the track. Otherwise, it would be pretty boring. I mean, that's the difficulty with tension and suspense. It's just keeping things interesting in the long run, and that's going to be through the use of like risers and transition effects, booms, whatever you can find to just generate some interest. But just to get started, I mean, the first plugin I've got up here is the Reason Rack plugin. Now, if you haven't heard of Reason, more specifically Reason 11, it's also a DAW, but it's more often used as an extension to any other DAW. I've actually written an entire product review on this plugin because I love it so much. I mean, I've been using Reason before they made it into a plugin, but the fact that it is now a plugin just makes life so much better for composers and producers like me. And so this is what it looks like. It's just basically a modular playground, and you got some pretty interesting sounds right out of the box. I'm not gonna get too deep into what Reason can do, but you just see like these are actually like a bunch of devices that are combined into what you call a combinator, and you can create sounds this way, like, especially for sound design stuff that you would never be able to create with any other plugin. So what I ended up using for this track is a glitch generator. It's kind of like that, we're gonna hear it later. It's that kind of it's that glitchy kind of like staticky kind of sound, like that's coming from that. The next I guess library that I'm using for effects, it's called Neural Exposure. That's an instrument that is in Storm Drum 2. Once again, we're talking about Composer Cloud. And yeah, this one is more of a sound design. It's in a folder called Sound Design Percussion, and it just has like a bunch of effects that you can use for sound design purposes. And as you can see, I actually labeled these by the pitch that you use to trigger them, because there are a lot of them and it just gets really difficult to keep track of everything. So this is how I keep track of that. But essentially these are risers. You're gonna hear them, like these are like before the end of each section, It's that is the riser that you're hearing. I'm also using a couple of other instruments from Sound Designer Percussion inside Storm Drum 2, which is these swoosh makers. Yeah, so these are two different libraries. I actually don't think I'm using this one. That's because I ended up bouncing this one to audio. But yeah, so these are just little, you'll hear them. They're just kind of like very subtle bits of sound design that are spread out throughout. Like they're just like you see them. They're like little points that are triggered. It's not very noticeable, but you'll definitely pick up on them if you try and listen to them. So yeah, I'd say let's listen to what these sound like on their own. And I've got these routed to sound effects too, so they've got their own submix. Yeah, so other than that, let's jump into the listening. Okay, so that pretty much covers the entire track in regards to parts. Now, the last thing I want to look at is just my mixing and mastering process for this project. But I mean, in general, like I'm not really using anything drastically different throughout the different projects I work on. So, I mean, like the staple that you'll notice if you just take a quick glance is if we just don't look at the submixes, let's just focus on the tracks themselves. I always use a channel EQ and a compressor. Like that's the only thing you really need to mix is just those two plugins. And on some tracks, I might add something special, like it might be just whatever that specific track needs. In this case, it's effects. So like I added some tremolo. These are for the texture, the texture section, and the tremolo actually is not like used um, in the conventional sense. It's used more like at a very low depth and like at a really low intensity, 1 bar, to just create almost kind of like an automation, like a breathing sound, like you would normally do with the use of a modulation wheel. But I mean, I guess I just got lazy for this one. So that's a kind of like a shortcut way of getting that effect. You could use a tremolo. So that's a little cheat code for you guys there. But I mean, don't use it if it's detrimental for the track. But in this case, it fit perfectly. I use Pancake a couple of times, and that's once again is that plugin that just pans things from left to right, automates it, makes things a little bit more interesting in the stereo image. But that pretty much covers it. I'm not gonna get too deep into like the actual presets for each track. I'll end up making tutorials dedicated to that in the future. So If you're really interested though, just leave me a comment about specific things you want to know about EQ and compression, and I'll make a video for you, no problem. But what I really want to talk about is what I'm doing in these sub mixes. So that, like I said earlier, like I like to separate the tracks from the sub mixes because there's basically two sets of plugins that I use for mixing, and those are the ones that we just talked about now, and it's also the plugins that I use for I call it the second phase of my mixing process, which is, once again, it's another channel EQ, which just encompasses all the tracks that are routed to that submix. And one of my favorite plugins in the entire world, and this one is not free, sadly, but I mean, it's completely worth your money. It's called Wolf Compressor. It was designed, well, partly designed by the leader of the band Wolfpack, Jack Stratton, and man, this plugin, it just enhances whatever you feed through it. Like, it's more than just a compressor. Like, you'll have to read in on it to like actually understand what it's doing. But yeah, I'll probably have to make a video just dedicated to this plugin. But I always use this plugin at least a little bit in my sub mixes. I mean, like in these cases, I've got them set pretty high, 80%. That's just like a mix knob. But yeah, this really like colors the sound in a really interesting way, and it just wouldn't sound the same without it. Lastly, using reverbs, the stock Logic Chromaverb, which is, in this case, it's used as glue, but it's also used as spatialization to really create that ambience, especially for these sound effects buses. I'm using it as like to really create the sense of like a really big empty space. And for these types of tracks, like this genre, suspense and tension, you really want to put some emphasis on the space that you're creating in your mix. So that pretty much covers mixing. Now we're gonna move on to mastering. Okay, so the last thing we're gonna be talking about is my mastering chain. And I like to keep things pretty simple. Whether what you consider what I do to be simple or not remains to be questioned, but I think it's pretty simple. So the first plugin that I use is just a linear EQ. It's different than the typical channel EQ because it's more transparent. Actually, technically speaking, this is supposed to be fully transparent, but because of that, it actually ends up taking more CPU resources. So that's why I don't use it on every track. I just keep it for mastering. The second plugin I use, and this is something that not everybody will use, but I really like using it for mastering, is a multipressor. Now, if you're not familiar with multipressors, it's short for multiband compressor, which basically means it's splitting up your frequency spectrum into different sections. So you can see we got 4 different sections here, and it's compressing each of those frequency regions independently from one another. So this really allows you to have maximum control over each area of your mix in terms of dynamics. So it really gives you that extra bit of control. And I mean, I don't have it set really high or anything like that, but it really makes a difference in my opinion. Like, I highly recommend using a multipressor. And if your DAW doesn't come with one, I would highly consider purchasing one. Third plugin I have running is Wolf Compressor, but this one is set lower than the other ones. I usually have it set lower. For some reason, I have it set pretty high on this one, but it's just to give the final master just that extra bit of oomph. It just really makes it sound, well, it makes it sound like, me, and it would not sound like this if I didn't use Wolf Compressor. So this is actually part of my signature sound. Like, I would would not be the same without Wolf Compressor, and you guys are going to start realizing how often I use this plugin, so get used to it. Next thing I have is just stock Chromaverb, which is the Logic Pro stock reverb, and I like this 80s Golden Gate preset. I use it on pretty much all my tracks just because it's like a really flat reverb. It doesn't really have much of a character. It works really well to glue things together, and that's why I have it set relatively low. So I'm not using this to create the space. Like, this is all done in the mixing stage. Like, the reverb I use in mastering is just to glue things together. And last but not least is a limiter. Like, you can't master without a limiter. Like, you absolutely need to have a limiter if you're going to master your track. So this just basically is used to get your track up to the level that you want it to, the loudness to be more specific, and it prevents your track from clipping. So this is super important. I'm not going to get too deep into that. The last plugin I want to talk about is a loudness meter that I use. I actually don't use the one that comes with Logic Pro. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but I really like this one. It's actually free, but there is a paid version. But I just think this one works a lot better. It looks a lot nicer, and yeah, it works better for my purposes. So yeah, that pretty much takes care of mastering. So I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial and that it's given you a couple of new ideas to try out for your next project. At the very least, I hope that it inspires you to go out there and learn a new genre of music. It doesn't necessarily have to be this one. As long as you're willing to keep learning in the music industry, you're guaranteed to succeed. That's one of the main things I hope to accomplish with this series, to inspire you to keep learning and growing as a musician. That being said, if you'd like me to elaborate on anything we've covered in today's video, just leave me a comment and I'd be more than happy to create a video dedicated to that specific thing. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we'll be releasing more videos in this series in the weeks to come, covering a variety of different musical genres. And on that note, I thank you for your time. We'll see you in the next one.